My daughter-in-law treated me like a blind puppet. She moved into my house and started doing things so insane you wouldn't believe them unless I told you today. So stay with me till the end of this video, because what you're about to hear is my real family drama. But before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? I'd love to know. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to support me. If you see me sitting calmly now, know that last night I almost died from a snakebite inside my own home. It was close to midnight when I got up to use the bathroom. My knees were stiff, and every step felt like dragging a bag of stones, so I gripped the railing tightly as I went down the stairs. The house was silent, that kind of silence that hums in your ears until the smallest sound feels loud. From the kitchen came a faint rustling, like whispers behind a door, then a sharp metallic scrape, as if something brushed against steel. I froze halfway to the light switch, holding my breath. Caroline, my daughter-in-law, had been locking the refrigerator lately. She said it was for my health, that I was too fond of late-night snacks, and that my heart couldn't handle the weight. I knew she was lying, though I couldn't yet tell why. When I stepped closer, a thin greenish light flickered from the crack behind the fridge. A foul, wet smell spread through the air, faint but wrong, like rotten eggs mixed with damp earth. I hesitated, my hand trembling slightly. Then something moved. At first it looked like a shadow, but the floor shimmered as it slid forward. A long, sinuous body emerged from the darkness, its scales catching the dim light like shards of glass. My breath caught in my throat. It was a snake, thick and slow, curling across the tiles just a few feet away from me. I stumbled back, my heel hitting the wall. My body stiffened, yet my instincts from years as a veterinarian kicked in. I recognized the pattern instantly, cottonmouth venomous, native to the region. But what was it doing here inside my kitchen? The air seemed to pulse as the creature flicked its tongue, tasting the fear that filled the room. I reached for the broom near the counter, my hands shaking. The snake turned its head toward me, black eyes gleaming. For a second, everything was still. Then I heard footsteps above Caroline's door creaking open. I stayed silent, my heart pounding like a drum, afraid even my breath might betray me. The snake slithered back toward the gap behind the refrigerator, disappearing into the same slit of light. I stood frozen, clutching the broom, the smell of metal and decay still thick in my nose. I knew one thing for certain: whatever was happening in my house was not just about food or weight. It was something darker, and it had just revealed its first hiss. I used to be a woman everyone in town recognized. My name is Dahlia Mercer, and for 30 years I worked as a veterinarian in a small clinic outside Columbus, Ohio. People brought me broken animals, dogs left on highways, cats rescued from basements, even injured horses from the county fairgrounds. I never turned any of them away. The local newspaper once called me the woman who speaks for the voiceless. Those were the years I felt most alive, with my hands steady and my heart stronger than my body ever was. But time has its own way of softening even the fiercest spirits. When I turned 63, I was diagnosed with insulin resistance. Retirement wasn't in my plans, but the dizziness and fatigue came too often. Within a year, I sold my practice and tried to adjust to quiet mornings. Without the chaos of the clinic, the house felt too still. I began baking to fill the silence, and the weight crept on slowly, then all at once. My knees complained first, then my lower back. Some days I moved like a woman twice my age, but I told myself it was just a phase. The truth was, I still lived comfortably. The house, a 2-story brick home with white shutters and a garden full of hydrangeas, was fully paid off. I had nearly $400,000 in savings, enough to live decently, maybe travel, maybe fix the porch that always creaked. I wasn't rich, but I was free, or so I thought. My son Landon used to be my pride, a gentle boy with kind eyes who once helped me bandage an injured dog when he was 10. He grew into a decent man, steady and careful, the type who apologized even when things weren't his fault. When he brought Caroline home 5 years ago, I tried my best to like her. She was lively, ambitious, the kind of woman who filled the room with opinions before she even sat down. At first, I admired her confidence. I thought maybe she'd bring laughter back into the family. But over time, something in her tone changed. She started calling me sweetie in that sharp, polished voice that doesn't mean kindness. She rearranged my kitchen, told me which foods were bad for me, and kept the house locked tighter than a clinic at night. Landon brushed it off as her way of showing care. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe she was just young and misunderstood. But deep down, some instinct I'd honed through years of treating wounded creatures told me this house wasn't as safe as it looked. Caroline Vaughn came into my life like a well-dressed, storm-bright smile, soft voice, eyes that never quite matched her words. She had a background in biology, though she called it wildlife research to sound noble. Landon once told me she'd left her previous job because of a disagreement with management. Later, I learned whispers of something darker, a quiet investigation about trading exotic animal specimens online. It never made the papers, but in small towns, silence often hides the loudest truths. When my health started slipping, and the doctor said the words insulin resistance, Caroline transformed overnight. She became the model daughter-in-law, fussing over my meals, bringing home brochures about healthy living, and convincing Landon that I shouldn't live alone anymore. "Mom needs us," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. I watched her place her hand over his, the gesture rehearsed like a scene from a play. Within a month, she sold her small townhouse, saying it was unnecessary now that we'd all lived together. She told everyone she wanted to care for me. The truth I would later understand was that moving in wasn't about love, it was about control. From the day they arrived, the house no longer felt like mine. She changed the locks for safety, she said, because old houses attract break-ins. She rearranged the kitchen, labeled my pantry with calorie counts, replaced my butter with something called almond spread. She bought a digital scale for my food, then another one for me. I caught her once, staring at the numbers, smiling slightly when they didn't change. The cameras came next. Tiny black dots appeared in the corners of the living room, the hallway, even the kitchen. "So we can monitor your health," she explained sweetly, connecting them to her phone. I tried to protest, but Landon cut in gently. "She just wants to help Mom. Don't make this harder." I bit my tongue and nodded, though my stomach churned. I began to feel like one of the animals I used to rescue, trapped and watched in a clean cage. Caroline started tracking my schedule when I woke up. What time I ate, how long I napped. If I stayed up reading, she'd appear in the doorway, smiling that same thin smile, saying, "I should rest." Her voice was honey, but her eyes were knives. Every day, the walls of my own home inched closer. And I began to wonder not when she would hurt me, but how soon. Caroline's kindness was a performance so flawless that even I wanted to believe it sometimes. To the neighbors, she was the perfect daughter-in-law. Every Tuesday morning, she'd wheel me out to the car, smile at Mrs. Porter from across the street, and say, "We're heading to the doctor again." "Gotta make sure Mom stays strong." People would nod approvingly, call her an angel, and wave as we drove off. She always made sure I looked neat, pressed cardigan, brushed hair, a touch of lipstick. I was her prop, a silent proof of her goodness. But once the front door closed, the mask came off. The same hands that gently adjusted my scarf would slam the fridge door shut. She rationed my meals like I was a patient in a lab study. Too much salt isn't good for your heart, she'd say, ladling watery oatmeal into a bowl. Lunch was steamed vegetables without seasoning, dinner the same, sometimes a boiled egg if she was feeling generous. The refrigerator was locked with a code pad. I once tried to open it when she was out thinking maybe I'd just forgotten the number, but no, she had changed it. When I asked, she smiled and said, "I'll unlock it when you learn not to sneak sugar." Her voice was sweet as syrup, but her eyes were empty. I began to lose weight, not from diet, but from fear. My reflection grew smaller each week. Then came the paperwork. She took me to see Dr. Lawson, our family physician. I trusted him for years, but lately he looked at me with puzzled concern. "Dahlia," he said gently, "Caroline tells me you've been forgetting things. Do you remember our last visit?" I blinked. I hadn't forgotten. But Caroline had given him something medical forms I hadn't seen before. Later, when she left them on the counter by mistake, I glanced at one. My name was on it, along with false notes, patient exhibits, confusion, paranoia, memory lapses. My hands trembled. That was the moment I realized her real plan. She wasn't just feeding me scraps, she was feeding the system lies. Slowly, she was building a case that I was no longer competent. If she could prove I wasn't of sound mind, she could become my legal guardian. My money, my house, my life all under her control. I used to rescue animals from cages. Now I was the one trapped, watching the door close inch by inch, the sound of the lock clicking like a final verdict. The silence in my house grew thicker each day, like fog that refused to lift. I used to hear laughter running up and down the stairs, small feet. Quick giggles, the sound of my grandchildren racing to show me their drawings. Now, when I called their names, there was only the hum of the air vent and the faint echo of my own voice. Caroline had gotten to them. I didn't know what she told them exactly, but one afternoon I overheard her whisper to little Emma, her tone soft but sharp underneath. "Grandma forgets things, sweetheart. Sometimes she gets confused. You shouldn't stay too close, just in case." After that, the children stopped coming to my room. When I waved from the top of the stairs, they looked away, uneasy, their toys clutched tightly in their hands. The distance hurt more than hunger ever could. When I tried to call my old friends or Mrs. Porter next door, the phone never connected. Caroline would sigh, pretending to check her screen. "The Wi-Fi's down again," she'd say. "Rural service, you know how it is." But the moment I gave up and set the phone aside, I'd hear her downstairs laughing over a video call. Once, I caught the faint buzz of the router light hidden behind her books. It was never broken. She just didn't want me talking to anyone. My world shrank to four walls and the sound of my own breathing. From the window of my small upstairs room, I could see the driveway where new plastic bins began to appear. They were large, heavy-looking, the kind used for transporting medical supplies or animals. She carried them inside at night, always glancing up toward my window, as if daring me to ask. My knees ached too much to go down the stairs, and she knew it. I sat there trapped, watching shapes move in the dark, her silhouette bending, shifting, locking something away. Sometimes I imagined I heard hissing from below, faint, but real enough to freeze the blood in my veins. The second floor became my cage. No bars, no chains, just isolation, carefully designed to look like care. She'd knock lightly on my door before bed, smiling sweetly. "Need anything, Mom?" She'd ask, her voice full of false warmth. I'd shake my head, pretending not to see the camera light blinking from the corner shelf. When she walked away, her footsteps faded like a clock ticking down. I realized then that prisons don't always need locks or guards. Sometimes they're built from love twisted into control and trust turned into a weapon. and I once strong enough to rescue others was now the one waiting to be saved. The day Caroline locked the refrigerator was the day I stopped feeling like a mother and started feeling like a prisoner. She stood in the kitchen with her arms folded, the digital lock blinking green in her hand. "For your health," she said softly, as if she were reading from a script. "From now on, we'll open the fridge only at fixed times." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the sound died in my throat. She installed a code lock on the handle and programmed it to beep every time it opened. "This will help control your sugar cravings," she added, smiling. I didn't remember asking for help. Every evening, she recorded me while I ate. The camera on her phone was always on, hovering just far enough to seem accidental. Say hi to Landon, she'd chirp, then stop filming mid-sentence, pretending to adjust the angle. Later, I overheard snippets of her calls. "She keeps sneaking snacks," she told him. "Her glucose levels are climbing again. I hadn't eaten anything but oatmeal and boiled greens for weeks." Yet when Landon called, his voice sounded tight, disappointed. "Mom, please try to follow the plan. Caroline's doing her best." The plan. That word felt like a chain. I swallowed my anger, said I would try, then hung up before my tears could betray me. A few days later, a new refrigerator arrived, a sleek silver model with a digital screen on the door. "A smart fridge," Caroline announced proudly. "It tracks inventory and has a built-in camera so I can monitor your meals remotely." My stomach turned cold. She laughed as if it were the most thoughtful gift in the world. That night when she went upstairs, I stood alone in front of the glowing screen and caught my reflection, small, pale, and tired. The camera lens blinked faintly back at me like an unblinking eye. I started memorizing her habits, watching when she entered the code. The first time, I saw her fingers move 2 quick taps, then a pause, then 3 more. I repeated the rhythm in my mind until it felt like a heartbeat. That night when the house went quiet, I crept downstairs. My knees screamed with every step, but I pushed through. I entered the numbers slowly, afraid even the beep would wake her. The lock clicked open soft and low. Inside, I saw not just food, but things that didn't belong there. Small plastic boxes sealed with tape, faint labels written in Caroline's handwriting. I didn't touch them, not yet. I just closed the door, heart pounding. Whatever this was, it was no longer about health. It was about control, and I had just taken my first step toward taking it back. After midnight, the house became something else, a place that breathed and whispered when no one was supposed to. I started hearing it first as a murmur, soft and rhythmic, like someone speaking under their breath. Then came the metallic click, sharp and deliberate, the sound of a lock turning somewhere downstairs. Every time it happened, my heart jolted awake. I would sit up in bed, straining to separate the noise from my imagination. But it was real. The clicks always came from the direction of the kitchen. Then came the smell. It drifted up the stairs slowly, thick and sour, not from food, but from something unnatural. It smelled like heated plastic mixed with the faint, iron-like tang of disinfectant. Or worse, something once alive. I tried to ignore it at first, covering my nose with the blanket, telling myself it was just the refrigerator's motor. But the odor grew stronger, almost sticky, clinging to my throat. I could taste it when I breathed. One night, I gathered my courage and opened my bedroom door just an inch. A weak green glow pulsed from below, leaking through the stair railings. The light wasn't steady. It flickered like the heartbeat of a machine. I leaned forward, gripping the wall to steady my knees. The faint hum of an engine echoed through the dark, mechanical and cold. It came from the kitchen, from the same spot where the refrigerator stood. I remembered that green light from the night of the snake. My chest tightened. I decided to wait to watch. Maybe Caroline would slip. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the tile floor. Slow, careful, but certain. I peeked through the gap of my door and saw her Caroline in a long gray robe, her hair tied back rubber gloves reaching up her elbows. She moved with precision, not like someone cleaning, but like someone working. She bent down to pick up the opaque plastic containers from behind the fridge. They were sealed tight, small enough to carry, but heavy enough to make her grunt. As she lifted them, the faint light reflected off the moisture on their sides. Then she spoke, voice low but clear enough for me to catch pieces. "Move this batch fast," she said into her phone. "They can't stay here long." My stomach dropped. Batch. The word rolled in my mind like a curse. I froze, afraid even my breathing could betray me. She disappeared through the back door, the hinges creaking softly, and the sound of her footsteps faded into the night. I stayed there, my hand trembling on the doorknob, staring into the thin green light that still glowed from the kitchen. Whatever was happening downstairs, it wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. And I knew then that my fear was no longer paranoia. It was instinct trying to keep me alive. When Landon called from Africa, the first thing I noticed was the sound of rain behind him. It came down in heavy sheets, blurring his connection until his face looked like a watercolor painting. I smiled anyway, trying to hide the tremor in my hands. "There's something strange in the house," I said quietly. "I keep hearing noises at night, and the fridge." Before I could finish, Caroline appeared behind me, still wearing her perfect smile. "Oh, Mom's just been watching too much TV," she said lightly, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You know how those crime shows get into her head?" Landon laughed, the kind of laugh meant to ease tension, but it only made my stomach twist. "Mom, you've got to relax," he said. "Caroline says you're overthinking again." I nodded, forcing a smile. It was easier than fighting two people through a screen. That night, I decided to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. I waited until the house was silent, then opened the security app Caroline had installed on the living room camera. It showed only a blank screen. I tried again, nothing. The small red light on the camera was off. The next morning, I asked her why. She looked at me with calm confusion, as if I'd spoken another language. "There's no problem with the camera," she said softly. "You probably dreamed that." Gaslighting, that's what it was. I'd read about it in psychology journals years ago, how abusers make their victims question their own minds. And now it was happening to me, drip by drip, until reality started to blur around the edges. I tried another way. When Caroline went out for groceries, I opened my old laptop, determined to email Landon directly. My fingers shook as I typed. "Something's wrong here. Please call me privately." I hit send. The email disappeared, but later, when I checked the sent folder, it was empty. Then I noticed a small gear icon next to my mailbox. Caroline had set a filter rerouting all my messages to drafts. She'd made sure I could write but never reach anyone. My throat went dry as I realized how completely she'd sealed me off. No phone calls, no emails, no proof. Just my word against hers. But even as fear pressed against my ribs, something inside me hardened. I looked at my reflection in the laptop screen, pale, tired, but still me. My mind was not gone. Not yet. If she thought I would surrender quietly, she didn't know who I used to be. I spent a lifetime saving creatures no one else cared about. I could save myself, too. For the first time in months, a spark flickered behind my eyes. It wasn't hope yet, but it was close. It was resistance. It happened by accident, as most revelations do. One afternoon, while Caroline was out running errands, I wandered into the living room to dust the shelves. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something else, chemical sharp. I sat down for a moment to rest my knees and noticed an old stack of magazines tucked under the coffee table. Most were medical journals and health magazines probably left there for show. I flipped through them lazily until one headline caught my eye. Illegal reptile specimen trafficking ring, busted in Florida. My breath caught. There, printed in small black letters halfway down the article, was a name I could never mistake. Caroline Vaughn, 29. A former research assistant is under investigation for her role in the transport and sale of restricted biological materials. The article ended abruptly, saying the case was under review. My fingers went cold. When she returned home, I tried to sound casual. "Caroline." "Dear," I said, holding the magazine open, "did you ever work in Florida?" She froze for just a second too short for anyone else to notice, but I saw it. Then she smiled, that practiced, easy smile she used for strangers. "Oh, that," she laughed. "Just old biology work, boring stuff, not worth remembering." She took the magazine from my hand as if it were trash, tossed it into the bin, and walked to the kitchen. "Let's make you some tea, Mom," she said, her tone suddenly syrupy sweet. When she handed me the cup, I saw a faint cloud swirling on the surface, dissolving slowly. My years as a vet taught me the signs of sedation-powdered residue that never quite blends. I lifted the cup, pretending to sip, and smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said softly. The moment she turned away, I poured it into the potted fern beside me. That night, while she thought I was sleeping, I stayed awake, my senses sharper than ever. From that day on, I began to watch her the way I once watched an injured animal, quietly, patiently waiting for the pattern to show itself. Packages started arriving twice a week, always late in the evening. The boxes were plain brown, sealed, tightly labeled only lab supplies, private biological research. But no permit notice ever appeared on the front door, and no delivery man stayed long enough for a signature. She would carry them to the basement herself, moving quickly, glancing up the stairs as if expecting someone to be watching. Each new box made the smell in the house stronger plastic disinfectant decay. I didn't need proof to know that whatever she was hiding, it wasn't medicine. And for the first time, the fear inside me turned into something else. It wasn't panic anymore. It was focus. It started with a memory, small, fragile, but sharp enough to pierce through fear. I remembered an old iPhone I used to use years ago, tucked somewhere in the medicine cabinet. That night, while Caroline showered upstairs, I slipped quietly into the bathroom, opened the drawer beneath the bandages, and found it lying there beneath a box of gauze, dusty but intact. My hands trembled as I plugged it in, praying it would still charge. When the screen flickered to life, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, a pulse of control. I turned on the recorder, lowered the volume, and wrapped the phone in a kitchen towel to muffle its light. Then, moving slower than breath, I hid it behind the microwave, its small red dot blinking like a secret heartbeat. The next night, I pretended to go to bed early. From my room upstairs, I could hear faint noises, doors creaking, footsteps dragging across the tile. I closed my eyes and let the recorder do what I could not. The house seemed to breathe in sync with my fear. Every minute stretched like an hour. Sometime after midnight, I heard the metallic click again, then silence followed by the unmistakable rasp of something heavy being dragged. I didn't dare move. At dawn, when Caroline left for her morning run, I retrieved the phone, my fingers cold against the metal. I played the recording with the volume low, pressing the speaker close to my ear. At first, there was only static. Then a woman's voice, Caroline's clear, calm, but laced with irritation. "Careful," she said sharply. "Don't let them get out again." The sound that followed was worse than any nightmare, a lid snapping open, something shifting and sliding like scales against plastic, then a low, wet hiss. My stomach turned. I stopped the playback, but the sound kept echoing inside my head. My hands were shaking when I replayed it, but this time I didn't feel afraid. I felt awake. Every doubt I'd been made to believe, every accusation of confusion or forgetfulness, shattered with each hiss that came from that speaker. There was something alive down there, and Caroline wasn't just hiding it. She was tending to it, feeding it. I copied the file onto a small USB drive, the kind Landon once gave me to store family photos. I slipped it into my insulin case beneath the plastic tray of needles. It felt oddly symbolic truth, hidden under medicine resistance disguised as routine. I closed the lid carefully and placed it back in the cabinet. It wasn't much, but it was the first proof I had that I wasn't losing my mind. For the first time, I looked at the stairs, not with fear, but with strategy. It was close to 2 in the morning when the crash came, a heavy, blunt sound that seemed to shake the entire house. I jolted awake, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I thought it was thunder. But then came the other noise, a long, tearing hiss, like metal being scraped open by claws. The air felt wrong, dense, and electric. I sat up listening. The sound came from downstairs. Something had fallen. Something alive was moving. Then the smell hit me. It crawled up the staircase before I even reached the door. A thick, foul odor that burned the back of my throat. It was part chemical, part organic, like melted plastic laced with raw blood. My stomach turned, but curiosity pressed harder than fear. I reached for my cane and the small, rechargeable flashlight I kept on my nightstand. The beam flickered weakly, a narrow slice of white cutting through the dark hallway. I opened the door. The air was humid, heavy with the stench of something spoiled. Each step down the stairs felt like walking through water. The wooden boards creaked louder than usual, and the further I went, the stronger the smell grew. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Halfway down, I stopped to catch my breath. From below came the faint hum of machinery and the irregular clink of glass tapping against metal. I could almost hear breathing low, labored, inhuman. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. A faint green light spilled across the kitchen floor, pulsing like a heartbeat. It came from the narrow gap behind the refrigerator. The same light I had seen before, but now it was brighter alive. Thin trails of smoke curled through the air, damp and shimmering like fog. I stepped closer, holding the flashlight tight in my hand. The floor beneath my feet was slick. I looked down and saw a smear of something dark, glistening under the beam. Blood or something that had bled recently. My chest tightened. I forced myself forward closer to the light. The hum grew louder like a motor struggling under weight. Then I heard it again, the scraping this time from inside the wall behind the refrigerator. I aimed the flashlight toward the noise, and for a split second, I saw movement, a quick serpentine shape, retreating into the darkness, scales catching the beam like glass shards. I gasped and stumbled backward, hitting the counter. The noise stopped. The light behind the fridge dimmed, fading into silence. I stood there for a long time, trembling, trying to steady my breath. Whatever Caroline was hiding wasn't equipment or samples, it was alive. And whatever it wasn't supposed to be here. The morning after the crash, I went down to the kitchen, determined to see what Caroline had been hiding. The air was still heavy with that strange metallic odor, though fainter now, as if someone had tried to clean it away. I noticed right away that the refrigerator wasn't in its usual place. It stood at a slight angle a few inches away from the wall. The marks on the tile behind it were fresh, thin arcs of dust, smeared as if someone had dragged it out and pushed it back in haste. My pulse quickened. I gripped my cane and shuffled closer. When I leaned in, I saw something that hadn't been there before. A jagged crack ran along the wall behind the fridge, and beneath it was a dark gap. narrow but deep enough to swallow the beam of my flashlight. I crouched slowly, my knees creaking, and tapped the floor just beneath the opening. The sound that came back wasn't solid. It echoed hollow, distant, like knocking on an empty drum. I froze. There was space behind that wall. Holding my breath, I reached out with trembling fingers and pressed along the edge of the tiles. One of them shifted slightly beneath my hand. I pushed again, and the section of wall gave way with a soft scrape, sliding sideways to reveal a hidden panel. Behind it yawned a small doorway, no higher than my shoulder, framed by splintered wood. Cold air seeped through, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and machinery. I lifted the flashlight, angling it toward the darkness. What I saw made my stomach twist. A set of old wooden stairs led downward into what looked like a basement. But this house wasn't supposed to have one. Landon and I had bought it 20 years ago, and I knew every inch of its structure. There was no basement on the plans. Yet here it was hidden secret and humming faintly with the sound of air blowing through unseen vents. I bent lower, listening. Somewhere beneath a rhythmic mechanical hum, pulsed like the breathing of some buried thing. I could almost feel the vibration through the floorboards. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to move as if the air itself shifted. I straightened quickly, my knees shaking. Whatever Caroline had built or hidden down there, it wasn't meant to be found. I closed the tile panel, pressing it back into place, and stepped away, heart pounding. But as I did, a faint draft brushed my ankle, cold, steady, unnatural. The door might have been shut, but something below was still awake. The beam of my flashlight quivered as I aimed it down the hidden staircase. The air that drifted up was warm and thick, carrying a smell so strange it made my stomach twist, a mix of soil disinfectant and something musky, alive. I hesitated at the top step, gripping the railing for balance, but curiosity, or maybe fury, pushed me onward. Each plank groaned beneath my weight as I descended. When I finally reached the bottom, my light landed on something that made my breath stop cold. Rows of plastic boxes lined the floor, stacked nearly to the ceiling. Some were fogged from condensation, others crystal clear, revealing the things writhing inside. Snakes. Dozens of them. Coiled, slithering their bodies, moving against the transparent walls like liquid shadows. I recognized the patterns immediately. Emerald green pit vipers, juvenile pythons, and then my heart clenched when I spotted one striped red, black, and yellow. A coral snake, highly venomous, illegal to keep without federal permits. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The walls were covered in heating lamps and temperature sensors wired to a control panel that hummed faintly. Next to it, a clipboard hung by a nail. I lifted it with trembling hands and read the words scrawled in Caroline's neat handwriting. Shipment 17A, Delivery Miami, Buyer coded CV. My throat went dry. CV Caroline Vaughn. Her initials. She wasn't done with her old business. She'd brought it into my home. I turned the light toward the far corner and saw chaos. Several of the boxes had been overturned, lids cracked open. A trail of mucus and shed scales glistened across the cement floor. My body froze. Some of them were gone, escaped. The hiss I had heard nights ago wasn't a dream. They had been here, moving freely while I slept upstairs. The flashlight flickered, catching on a line of heat lamps suspended from the ceiling, each one labeled and wired together. I suddenly remembered the online order Caroline bragged about weeks earlier. "They're just for my houseplants," she'd said. LED grow lights great for seedlings. But standing there, surrounded by heat lamps and oxygen regulators, I realized what they really were: incubators for reptile eggs. She hadn't been growing plants. She had been breeding. My knees weakened, but anger steadied me. The air pulsed with the warmth of the machines, and the snakes inside the boxes shifted restlessly, their eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam. I backed slowly toward the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The truth was worse than I'd imagined. My home wasn't a home anymore. It was a breeding den for something illegal, alive, and deadly. And Caroline, my daughter-in-law, was at the center of it all. I turned toward the stairs, my flashlight flickering, my breath shallow. That was when I felt something brush against my ankle, soft, heavy, deliberate. I froze. Slowly, I aimed the light downward, and the beam caught a glint of movement. A python, no thicker than my wrist, but nearly 6 feet long, slithered from the shadowed corner. Its body looped gracefully around the leg of my cane scales, scraping faintly against the metal. My pulse spiked, but I didn't scream. Years in veterinary work had trained me to move slow, steady, never give a reptile reason to strike. I whispered to myself, as if to an old patient, "Easy now." I tried to lift the cane gently, but the snake shifted, tightening slightly, curious rather than aggressive. I took a cautious step back, and my shoulder bumped against the metal table behind me. The impact rattled through the basement, and before I could react, one of the plastic boxes on the top shelf toppled over. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, the lid bursting open. From within, a thin black cobra uncoiled, spreading its hood wide, the scales glinting under the flashlight beam. It hissed, a piercing sound that vibrated through the air like a blade being drawn. For a second, the world tilted. The smell of musk and heat lamps filled my nose. My knees went weak, and I thought I might collapse right there. But instinct, the one thing time hadn't stolen, took over. I had handled venomous species before years ago, back when I still believed every creature deserved calm, not fear. I adjusted my grip on the cane, shifted the beam of light, and waited for the right second. The cobra's head swayed, tasting the air. When it lunged forward, I moved faster than I'd thought possible. I pressed the end of the cane gently but firmly against its head, pinning it just enough to stop its movement without crushing it. My breathing was ragged but controlled. I kept my body still, my eyes locked on the snake. After a few tense seconds, I stepped back inch by inch, dragging the cane with me. The python had already retreated toward the shadows, slipping beneath the shelf. I didn't dare look away until I reached the first step of the staircase. Then, without thinking, I slammed the wooden hatch shut behind me. The echo rang through the kitchen like a gunshot. I leaned against the wall, trembling, my legs barely holding me. My hand clutched the cane so tight, it hurt. The house was silent again, but the silence wasn't empty. It pulsed, faint and steady, like something breathing deep underground. My lips moved before I could stop them, my voice no more than a whisper. It wasn't a person I heard, I said. It was the breathing of snakes. In the dim light of the basement, I turned the flashlight toward the far shelf, my pulse still pounding in my ears. That was when I saw it, a plain cardboard box, but with something printed across its side that made my stomach twist. The logo read Wildlife Genetics, Confidential Export. Below it in smaller letters was an address, Miami, Florida. My hand trembled as I brushed the dust from the surface. This wasn't medical research or any kind of legal shipment. It was organized, coded, deliberate. Caroline wasn't experimenting. She was exporting. Beside the box lay a notebook, the cover stained with something dark dirt, or maybe blood. I opened it slowly, careful not to disturb the pages. Her handwriting filled every line, neat and scientific, each page marked with symbols, measurements, and abbreviated species names. It wasn't until I reached the final page that the truth struck like a knife. Scrawled at the bottom were the words, "Next shipment before inspection. Remove old tags." My breath caught. She was altering identification codes, removing evidence, changing records before federal checks. It was a smuggling operation right beneath my kitchen floor. I sank down on the cold cement, my knees weak. I had seen cruelty before in the faces of men who abandoned their animals, in the eyes of creatures left to die. But this was something colder, systematic, calculated. She wasn't just hiding snakes. She was breeding them, shipping them, feeding a market that thrived on illegal trade. And she had done it here in my home, under my roof, using my silence as her cover. A single tear fell before I realized it. I pressed the notebook to my chest, my mind spinning through every lie she had told me. The lab supplies, the grow lights, the constant secrecy, all the small pieces now aligned into one monstrous puzzle. Caroline Vaughn, the woman I had defended, the woman I had once called daughter, was a criminal. Worse, she had used my illness, my isolation as her camouflage. When I finally climbed back up the stairs, every step felt heavier than the last. The air in the kitchen was cooler, cleaner, but it no longer felt like home. I lowered myself into the wooden chair by the table, the same chair where Caroline had served me soup, and smiled sweetly as she measured my sugar levels. My hands covered my face, and for the first time in years, I cried not out of fear, but out of heartbreak. I had spent months questioning my own sanity, only to find the truth was far worse. Trust had been my biggest mistake, and I had given it to the one person who had turned it into poison. For the first time in months, I opened my old veterinary notebook, not to heal another creature, but to save myself. Its pages were yellowed and soft at the edges, smelling faintly of iodine and dog shampoo. Between records of vaccines and feeding schedules, I found a page written in fading blue ink, Felix Layton, attorney, Columbus, OH. I remembered him clearly, a tall man with kind eyes who used to bring in his German Shepherd for therapy after an accident. He'd once told me, "If you ever need legal help, call me. I owe you more than a few vet bills." My hands shook as I picked up the backup phone I had hidden in the medicine drawer, the one Caroline hadn't found yet. It took 3 tries before I finally dialed. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "This is Layton," a voice said, calm and professional. "Felix." I whispered, my throat tightening. "It's Dahlia Mercer. I think my daughter-in-law is involved in something illegal." There was a pause, then his tone softened. "Dahlia, it's been years." He listened without interrupting as I told him everything about the hidden basement, the boxes, the snakes, the forged medical notes, even the lock on the refrigerator. When I finished, silence hung between us for a moment, broken only by the faint hum of static. "Listen carefully," he said finally, his voice steady but urgent. "You can't confront her. Not yet. People who hide crimes that large don't hesitate to protect themselves. Your first priority is your safety." Second, evidence. I gripped the phone tighter. Evidence. Yes. Anything inside your home that documents her activity belongs to you. Recordings, photos, even logs from the smart refrigerator. Those are all legally yours to access. Just make sure you don't trespass or invade any space outside your property line. Understand? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I understand," Good Felix continued. "You'll need proof strong enough to involve federal wildlife enforcement. But you must be careful. Keep everything discreet. If you can back up your data somewhere off-site, a cloud or an encrypted drive." I exhaled slowly. "Felix, I'm scared." "I know," he said quietly, "but you're also smarter than you think. You're the one who once taught a half-blind shepherd to track commands again. Use that same patience now. Gather what you need, then call me back." When the call ended, I sat there staring at the notebook. My heart still raced, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear, It was purpose. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a witness, preparing for war. I worked with my hands the way I used to in the clinic, slow and precise, letting the work calm my nerves. From the top shelf of the linen closet, I pulled down an old veterinary kit, cracked plastic stickers half peeled. Inside was a hollow compartment where I once kept sample vials. I nested a thumb-sized camera, their lens, peeking through a pinhole I made with a heated needle. I set the box on the counter with the label facing the kitchen, angled toward the refrigerator, and that secret hatch behind it. I tested the view on the backup phone. Doorway in frame, floor in frame, the seam of tile that hides the panel in frame. Good enough to stand in court. I waited until the house settled into its midnight rhythm. Hum of the smart fridge. Throb of the heaters beneath my feet. I pressed record and left the kit on the far end of the counter as if I had forgotten it there. Then I sat at the table with a mug of mint tea I did not drink and counted the seconds by the blinking of the router light. Movement began just past 1. The basement door eased open. A hand entered the frame. Plastic bins scraped tile. My little camera saw what my eyes had seen before and what no one had believed. Clear boxes with coiled bodies inside. Labels that read, "Wildlife Genetics." Condensation beating like sweat. The audio picked up more than I expected. The dry hiss of heat lamps. The pulse of a small fan. A faint rasp like scales against acrylic. I kept the recorder running and panned the kit an inch to widen the shot. More boxes. A clipboard left on the shelf. The green glow breathing behind the refrigerator. 18 minutes in total. Long enough for a judge to call it a pattern, Felix would say. When the house quieted again, I retrieved the kit, locked my bedroom door, and began the part that mattered most. I uploaded the file to cloud storage under an account no one in this house knew existed. I set a password that only 2 people in the world now knew. Me and Felix Layton. I made 2 copies on a small encrypted drive and tucked it into the lining of my insulin pouch. Then I opened my old email and wrote to my son in the simplest words I could manage. Subject line read, "If anything happens to me, open this." No drama, no accusation. Only a link and a sentence explaining that this was for his safety as much as mine. I hit send and watched the spinner turn until the message left my outbox. A legal life insurance made of pixels and sound. For the first time in months, I breathed without flinching. The fear was still there, but it finally shared a room with proof. I set the backup phone to silent, slid it under my pillow, and waited for morning. Felix moved faster than I expected, and every step he took felt like a light switching on in a dark house. He called me early with a steady voice and said he had spoken to federal wildlife officers, the ones from the Fish and Wildlife Service in our region. He asked for the video link and the audio file again, then said he would file a formal summary and preserve the metadata so the chain of custody would hold in court. He told me that he had also alerted the environmental agency and our local police, and that he was urging them to watch quietly rather than storm the house. We needed proof of commerce across state lines. He said not just a room full of snakes. I wrote his words into my notebook so I would not forget. Quiet watch. Crossing state lines. Preserve everything. He reminded me to speak to no one. Not Mrs. Porter, not the mail carrier, not even the children. He said that the strongest cover I had was the mask Caroline had placed on me, the image of a frail woman who naps at noon and forgets her own tea. Let her keep that picture, he said. If she believes you are harmless, she will make mistakes. I nodded at the empty room and promised him I would play the part. After the call, I opened a fresh page and began a legal diary. I wrote the date and the exact time in simple numbers that I could track without error. I wrote about the air in the kitchen at dawn, the way it still tasted of warm plastic and bleach. I recorded the sound of the basement fan starting at 1:05 and winding down at 2:15. I noted how Caroline wiped the refrigerator handle with alcohol and then misted a scented spray that smelled like lavender, trying to bury something sour. I wrote about deliveries, brown boxes with no return address, a driver who never stayed for a signature, the way car lights paused at the curb and then slid away. Felix called again in the evening. He told me the agencies had opened a file. He said that if we waited and gathered enough, we could tie at least one shipment to Miami, and perhaps more. He asked me to keep backing up everything in 2 places and to store a copy off-site if I could manage it. I slipped a second drive into my coat pocket and planned a short walk to the church donation bin, where there was a hidden shelf behind a stack of hymnals. I would hide it there until Felix collected it. All day I spoke softly, moved slowly, and thanked Caroline for the tasteless soup. At night, I wrote like a clerk in a quiet courthouse. Time, sound, smell, action. By the 3rd page, my fear had shifted into rhythm. I was no longer only surviving. I was building a case. Caroline's suspicion began like a draft slipping under a closed door, subtle at first, but cold enough to make the air change. I noticed it the morning she came up from the basement earlier than usual. Her smile stretched too tight. The lock on the basement door had been replaced overnight. Not the old silver latch, but a new one, 3 heavy bolts in a row, bright and polished like fresh teeth. She said she was tightening things for safety. I nodded and stirred my coffee, pretending not to notice the new padlock key hanging from her necklace. Later that day, I heard faint hammering behind the kitchen wall. When I went to look, she was wiping the surface with disinfectant painting over a small patch near the refrigerator where dust had once gathered around the hidden seam. "Just cleaning up," she said with that sugary tone. But her eyes flicked toward me, sharp and watchful. The wall was her secret, and now she knew I knew. By evening, new technology had arrived. A sleek white box sat on the counter, blinking faintly. "A motion sensor," she explained, smiling. "It'll alert me if anyone comes downstairs at night. You know, in case you ever need help." Her hand brushed my shoulder in mock affection, but her phone buzzed every time I so much as opened a cabinet. I could feel her watching through her apps, measuring my movements as if I were another specimen in her collection. Her sweetness thickened over the next few days like syrup left too long on the stove. She brought me tea with extra honey. She left small bouquets of daisies by my chair. She spoke softly, but every sentence carried a double edge. "You should rest more," she'd say. "Your body's been through so much. Sometimes people our age start seeing things that aren't really there." She said it like a doctor, not a daughter. One afternoon, she came into my room holding a cup of tea that smelled faintly bitter. She set it down, sat across from me, and smiled without warmth. "At your age," she said lightly, "people forget things so easily. If something ever happens, people will just think you were confused." The words landed softly, but I felt the chill beneath them. It wasn't concern. It was a warning disguised as care. I met her gaze and forced a small smile, the kind that used to soothe wounded dogs. "You're right," I said, "it's easy to forget." But inside, my mind was sharpening. I could feel the tide shifting. Caroline was done pretending I was harmless, and I was done pretending I didn't see her for what she was. I had spent weeks pretending to be helpless, but now it was time to weaponize that illusion. One morning, while Caroline was watering her plants, I clutched my chest and stumbled against the kitchen counter. The mug slipped from my hand, shattering across the tile. I let my knees buckle, gasping softly. Caroline rushed over, panic flashing in her eyes. Panic, not concern. She said, half annoyed, half calculating. I pressed a trembling hand to my forehead and whispered, I just got dizzy. Maybe I need someone to check the air conditioning. It's too warm in here. That night, I made a call on my hidden phone. She took the bait, I told Felix. The next morning, he arrived in a navy jumpsuit, a toolbox in hand, a cap pulled low. To Caroline, he was just another technician sent by the warranty company. She greeted him politely, but hovered nearby, her phone always within reach. Felix smiled, playing the part perfectly. Shouldn't take long, ma'am, he said. Might just be a vent filter issue. While Caroline busied herself upstairs, Felix worked fast. He removed the vent cover near the kitchen ceiling, mounted a small black device, and sealed it back in place. Motion-triggered high resolution, he whispered. It's aimed straight down the basement stairwell. I nodded, pretending to wipe the counter. Within 10 minutes, the air vents were closed again, and Caroline never suspected a thing. That afternoon, I sat alone at the kitchen table writing an anonymous report. My handwriting disguised by trembling lines, I described everything: the snakes, the basement, the illegal shipments. I sent copies to both the Ohio Police Department and PETA. I ended it simply. There is an illegal reptile breeding operation in Columbus, run by a woman identified as CV. Then I deleted every trace from my device and hid the phone under the cushion of my chair. When Felix called later, his tone was steady. They'll need time to build the case, but it's moving. If they get the warrant, stay out of it. Don't confront her, don't follow her. Let the law speak for you. I looked toward the basement door. This time I said quietly, I won't let kindness blind me again. I hung up feeling both fragile and fierce. For months I had been the prey, but now I was the evidence. The house that had once been my prison was becoming the stage where truth would finally step into the light. At exactly 7 a.m, the doorbell shattered the quiet. I had just poured my first cup of tea, the kind of calm routine I clung to when everything else felt fragile. The chime was sharp, urgent. Through the frosted glass, I saw 2 silhouettes, uniformed officers, and behind them, a familiar face in a navy suit. Felix. My pulse steadied not from peace, but from knowing the storm had finally arrived. I opened the door, and the taller of the 2 agents lifted a document in a clear plastic folder. Mrs. Mercer, he asked. I nodded. We have a federal search warrant for this property issued under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. His tone was firm, but professional. Felix stepped forward, his voice calm as ever. It's all right, Dahlia. You can stand with me. Behind us, footsteps echoed down the staircase. Caroline appeared hair-tousled, wearing her satin robe, feigning confusion with practiced grace. What on earth is going on? She demanded, clutching the railing. This is my home, mine and my husband's. You can't just barge in here like this. The shorter officer turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, we have credible evidence linking this residence to the illegal possession and transportation of protected wildlife species. You'll need to stay upstairs while we conduct the search. Caroline's eyes darted from the agents to me, then to Felix. For the first time, the mask cracked. You! She hissed, her voice low and venomous. You've been talking to someone, haven't you? Felix didn't flinch. He handed the warrant to the lead officer and said, all digital media video surveillance and still photography were lawfully recorded by Mrs. Dahlia Mercer within her own residence. They were authenticated and verified to match federal shipping codes associated with this address. Everything is in accordance with the law. The officers nodded and began their work. One moved toward the basement door, gloved hands gripping the handle. Caroline lunged forward, shouting, You can't go down there without— But the agent had already turned the knob. The scent of heat and chemicals spilled out instantly, the faint hiss of machinery breaking the morning's stillness. Flashlights cut through the dark, and one of them spoke into his radio. Confirmed. Multiple enclosures visible. Live specimens contained. I stood perfectly still, my teacup trembling in my hand, but my heart strangely calm. Felix glanced at me and gave a single nod. "You did everything right," he murmured. Caroline, pale and breathless, stared as the officers descended into the hidden room that had been her kingdom. The sound of her empire collapsing came not with explosions, but with the quiet click of evidence bags being sealed. When the officers finally turned on the basement lights, the air changed. The smell was still there. Faint traces of disinfectant and something earthy, but the space itself looked almost spotless. The rows of plastic boxes I had once seen were gone. The shelves were bare, the floor swept clean, and only the faint outlines of circular dust marks remained perfect ghosts of where the containers used to be. One of the officers glanced back at Felix, confused. "Looks empty," he said quietly. My heart sank for a moment, the fear of disbelief creeping back into my throat. Then Caroline laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was sharp, rehearsed, dripping with false pity. She crossed her arms and tilted her head toward me. "I told you," she said, her tone light and smug. "My mother-in-law has these episodes. She's been having trouble distinguishing dreams from reality. You can check the records. She's under evaluation for memory issues." Her words hung in the air like a performance she'd practiced for weeks. The younger officer frowned slightly, glancing between us. "Ma'am, we still need to complete the inspection," he said. But Caroline kept talking, her voice now soaked with mock sympathy. "She watches old videos on her phone, edits them, mixes them up. She's lonely, and sometimes she makes up stories to get attention. I didn't want to say anything, but it's been hard taking care of her." Every syllable felt like a blade cutting through the fragile trust I'd fought so hard to build. I kept my hands folded in my lap, forcing myself not to react. I could feel Felix's gaze on me, calm, steady. I turned my eyes toward him. For a moment, our looks met a silent message between two people who had already seen too much to be fooled. Wait. Just wait. The senior agent continued his sweep, his flashlight passing over the floor. He crouched down, touching the faint ring left by one of the missing crates. "There was something here," he murmured. Caroline's smile faltered for the briefest second. Felix noticed it. So did I. She recovered quickly, shaking her head. "That's dust from an old freezer. My husband removed it months ago." But her voice had lost its smooth edge. Felix stepped forward slightly. "Then you won't mind if they take samples," he said evenly. Caroline froze. The silence stretched until one of the officers opened his evidence bag and began scraping a thin layer of dust from the concrete. The sound of the plastic glove brushing against the floor was almost tender, and yet it was the sound of her story beginning to collapse. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The truth was already breathing beneath the surface. The air inside the house was stretched thin, so tight it felt like even the walls were holding their breath. The officers were still collecting samples when the sudden buzz of a phone shattered the silence. It came from the lead investigator's radio, a sharp tone, short and urgent. Everyone froze. The officer pressed the speaker button. A voice crackled through distorted but clear enough to slice through the room. "This is the inspection team at 2129 Westbrook," the voice announced. "We've located 27 containers filled with exotic snakes inside a private garage. 2 of those containers still bear shipping labels traced directly back to the Mercer residence." No one spoke for a moment. The words hung heavy, echoing through the living room. Felix was the first to move. His expression stayed calm, but there was a spark of quiet satisfaction behind his eyes. "May we see the live feed?" he asked. The officer nodded and turned the screen toward us. The image flickered, and then the truth appeared. On the screen, stacked inside a dimly lit garage, were dozens of plastic crates identical to the ones that had once filled my basement. And there, bold, unmistakable, was the printed label CV. The same initials that Caroline had written on every shipment form, the same letters she thought she'd erased. The camera zoomed closer, revealing two snakes fitted with microchips glinting under the flashlight beam. The tracking data confirmed it. They were from the same batch registered to the Mercer address. Felix smiled faintly, just enough for me to see it. That should answer any doubts, he said quietly. The officers in the room exchanged quick glances, their demeanor shifting from cautious to decisive. Caroline's composure cracked like glass. She took a step forward, her voice rising in panic. "No, that's impossible. Someone planted those. I've been framed." Her hands shook her face, pale but defiant. "You don't understand. I didn't." The lead investigator interrupted her, his tone firm but not unkind. "Ms. Vaughn, the federal tracking tags recovered from those containers match your credit card purchase for transport materials 2 weeks ago. The ID numbers are identical. The evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with finality. Caroline's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color drained from her face as the officer continued to speak into his radio, confirming the match for the record. I stood by the table, my hands clasped together, the teacup now cold beside me. For months, Caroline had controlled every corner of this house, my space, my voice, my peace. Now, in a single phone call, her empire had begun to collapse. Felix turned toward me, his voice low and steady. "You see, Dahlia," he said, "the law doesn't rush. But when it arrives on time." The living room filled with the low hum of radios and the clicking of camera shutters. The officers moved with calm precision, their vests brushing against the furniture that had once been part of Caroline's carefully curated image of perfection. She stood near the center of the room, her silk robe wrinkled, her hair-tangled mascara smudged beneath her eyes. When the lead investigator began to read the Miranda rights, the words echoed like a slow tolling bell. "You have the right to remain silent." Caroline's lip trembled. At first, she tried to maintain her composure, chin lifted high in defiance. But by the time the officer reached the phrase, "Anything you say can and will be used against you," her face crumpled. Tears spilled down, and a small, broken sound escaped her throat. Then she turned to me. "You did this," she said, voice trembling with fury and disbelief. "All of this because you hate me, because you could never stand that your son loves me." I looked at her steadily, the same way I had once looked at frightened animals who didn't yet know which part of them was dangerous. "No," I said quietly. "I did what a mother must do. I protected my home from the venom that was already inside it." Her expression froze, torn between rage and collapse. The officers moved in, slipping the cuffs over her wrists with practiced ease. Outside, the commotion had already drawn attention. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the driveway, whispering, phones raised. A local news van had pulled up, the red light on the camera blinking steadily. Through the window, I saw the lens turn toward us. The camera caught Caroline as the officers guided her to the door, barefoot, her robe hanging loosely, eyes wide and unfocused. The perfect image she had built for years shattered in a single frame. She stumbled once on the steps, then straightened, breathing hard as if still searching for a way to twist the story back into her favor. But no one was listening anymore. Her name was already being spoken in low, disbelieving tones by the neighbors who had once envied her. One of the federal officers leaned closer to Felix and spoke quietly. "She'll be transferred to the federal facility in Columbus. Lacey Act violation, interstate trafficking of protected species. That's a minimum of 5 years, maybe more." Felix nodded slightly, his expression unreadable, then turned to me. "Justice always finds its way," he said. I watched as the patrol car door closed with a hollow thud. The sound lingered in the air long after the vehicles pulled away. For the first time in months, the house was silent again, but this silence was clean, like a wound finally allowed to heal. The morning wind was cool, sweeping across the porch as the last patrol car turned out of the driveway. Its red and blue lights flickered once against the white fence, then disappeared down the quiet suburban street. I stood there still in my cardigan, the scent of chamomile tea fading from my hands. The house behind me felt hollow but free, like it had exhaled for the first time in months. My hair, silver and loose, brushed against my face as the wind rose again. I didn't flinch. I let it pass through me the way storms pass when they've finally spent their rage. Felix joined me on the steps, his shoes crunching softly against the gravel. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just watched the horizon, the world returning to stillness. Then I broke the silence, my voice low but steady. You know, I said she once told me I needed to learn how to let go to declutter my life. A faint, bitter smile touched my lips. I suppose now she understands what it truly means to be stripped of everything. Felix looked at me, his expression gentle but firm. You didn't just save yourself, Dahlia, he said. You saved countless living things from her cruelty. His words settled softly between us, carried by the wind like truth, finding its way home. I nodded, though my gaze stayed far beyond the houses and trees, beyond the morning sky that was just beginning to warm. I spent my life healing reptiles, I murmured, fixing their scales, stitching their wounds, easing their fear. My voice trembled, not from sadness, but from clarity. But this time I had to heal something else, the poison that grows inside people and calls itself power. Felix said nothing, and he didn't need to. We both knew the cost of justice wasn't measured in victories, but in what it takes from you to get there. I looked down the road once more where the faint glimmer of police lights had vanished entirely. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or even relief, just a deep, grounded stillness. The sun rose higher, catching on the silver strands of my hair. The reflection in the window showed a woman who had been called weak, paranoid, delusional, but who had outlasted the venom meant to destroy her. My eyes, once clouded by doubt, now held something sharper, an unyielding calm, the quiet steel of survival. When I finally turned back toward the house, the wind carried the faint echo of Felix's words. Justice always finds its way, and this time I believed him. The verdict came on a rainy afternoon. Through the courthouse window, I watched the gray clouds drift low, heavy, with the kind of silence that follows truth. Caroline stood before the judge, hands trembling, the confident posture she once carried, now gone. Her lawyer's voice was thin, pleading for leniency, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the shipping records, the microchip data, everything pointed to her guilt. When the gavel struck, the sound was final. She was sentenced to federal prison under the Lacey Act. 5 years, no parole. The words didn't bring me joy, only a strange, hollow calm. The woman who had once locked away my food, my freedom, and nearly my sanity was now the one behind bars. The irony wasn't lost on me. I remembered the day she told me I needed to control my appetite. Now it was her world that had been starved of air, stripped bare, until only the truth remained. Landon sat beside me during the sentencing, his face pale, his hands clasped so tightly they shook. When the judge adjourned the court, he turned to me, voice barely audible. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have believed you." I reached over, touching his hand gently. "You see clearly now," I said. "That's all that matters." He nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. He took a leave of absence from his job soon after moving back into the house to help me recover. The home felt warmer again, not because of what had been removed, but because of what had returned trust. My grandchildren came every weekend. At first, they were quiet, confused. The therapy sessions helped, and one morning when they arrived, they ran straight into my arms. "Grandma," the little one cried, "we know you weren't sick. You were brave." Their small arms wrapped around me, and for the first time in so long, I allowed myself to cry. Weeks later, a local paper ran a story with my picture beside the headline, "The woman locked away from her own fridge helped unlock justice." Felix sent me a copy, folded neatly, with a note, "Truth takes time, but it always leaves footprints." The officers from Fish and Wildlife visited, handing me a certificate of recognition. They said my cooperation had helped dismantle one of the largest illegal reptile trade rings in the Midwest. I smiled politely, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I wasn't thinking about snakes in cages. I was thinking about the one that had slithered into my family disguised as love. That night, I wrote in my old veterinary journal, "The last snake wasn't in a tank. It was inside the human heart." And when I closed the book, I finally felt the venom leaving mine. Morning light poured softly into the kitchen, spilling across the counters and catching on the silver edges of the kettle. The air was quiet, no more clicking locks, no more whispered movements in the dark. For the first time in months, I opened the refrigerator without fear. The soft hum of its motor filled the silence, steady and harmless. I reached for the tea leaves, inhaled the warm scent of chamomile, and smiled to myself. "No more whispers," I murmured. My reflection in the stainless steel door looked back at me, tired, yes, but free. Landon entered the room, still in his robe, holding 2 mugs. He leaned against the doorway, watching me for a moment, before speaking. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you ever regret what happened?" "Any of it." I placed the kettle down and turned to face him. "No," I said, my voice calm. "I only regret that I was patient with evil for too long. I thought kindness could tame it. But some things," I paused, glancing at the sunlight warming the tiles, "some things only learn from consequences." He nodded, eyes glistening, and handed me a mug. We sat together at the table, the same table where months earlier I'd been told what I could or couldn't eat. Now it was just wood and peace. Outside, the garden glimmered with dew, and for a moment, I thought of the snakes, of the fear, of the long nights I had spent wondering if justice would ever come. It had, but not through rage or revenge. It came quietly, like dawn. After Landon left to tend the garden, I opened my old journal, the one I used to keep for patient notes back when I still treated animals. I flipped to a fresh page and began to write slowly. The wicked can hide in the dark for a while, but never from the light of truth. My pen didn't shake. Each word felt deliberate, a closing of one chapter and the promise of another. As I wrote, the kettle whistled softly again. I stood, poured another cup, and felt the warmth settle into my hands. My home was silent, but this silence was not fear. It was peace. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it lives quietly, tucked away in the calmest kitchens, waiting for the right moment to breathe again. If you've ever been controlled, silenced, or isolated, don't stay quiet. Speak. Tell your story. Because sometimes justice begins with just one small voice.